All right, so I've spent quite a little bit of time on history. So let's talk a little bit about what Zoroastrians really believe, at least about the original revelation that Zarathustra is said to have had. Well, I mentioned the Amesha Spenta, that Zarathustra went off into the wilderness. He was cogitating about what he considered to be a blasphemous practice that were being conducted by the priests in his community. And of course, he apparently was one of them. He was one of the priestly families, and they were sacrificing animals in a wasteful manner in order to do magic for various warlords who were willing to pay them lots of money to do this. So it was basically killing animals for money, for magical purposes, with poor intention. And Anahita, who is considered a Yazata, which we'll talk about what a Yazata is in a minute, who is considered a Yazata, appeared to him and revealed the truth of the Amesha Spenta. So what are the Amesha Spenta, or the immortal holies? They are considered to be the great powers that create and maintain the universe. And the most important of these is Ahura Mazda. If you go over on the right column here, is Ahura Mazda, and he's considered to be a good god. I mean, basically the almighty power of the universe. The Ahura Mazda literally means wise lord or good lord. And Ahura and Mazda, one is a female term and one is a male term. I'm not sure right off which is male or which is female, but together they represent a unified and neutral divine power. He's also referred to as the good immortal or the good spirit, the Spenta Manyu, or Manyu, I guess is how you pronounce that. And he's the source of all of the other Amesha Spenta. And he represents all the creative process, wisdom, holiness, etc. And then the rest of the Amesha Spenta emerge from him, so to speak, or it emerge from Ahura Mazda. And Vohumana which literally means good mind, is the guardian of all the animals. So has created all the animal forms. And Vohumana is considered to be male. And he also represents good intentions and good conscience. And then there's Ashavahishta, or the guardian of all fires. And he's the window to Ahura Mazda. We'll talk more about what that means in just a minute. He's also male, but he also represents the ethical concept of truth and righteousness. And then there is Kshathra Vera, or the guardian of the sky, or the guardian of metals. He's also male, and he represents the good use of will. Now, what's interesting about Kshathra Vera is that in the earliest revelation, he is understood to be the guardian of the sky. And it was later that he was then also made guardian of metals. And what to some scholars this means is that it's proof that Zoroastrianism is older than some people think, because that it may actually represent a time when Zarathustra himself was not familiar with metal weapons, or that metal weapons or metallurgy was not common where he was, common enough that metal could be considered a separate thing to be a guardian of. What we do know is that in the oldest Iranian mythology or cosmology, the sky, the night sky, was considered to be made of stone, that it was stone. And the reason why they thought that is because of lapis lazuli. If you know what lapis lazuli looks like, it's that dark indigo blue with these white speckles in it. And it was thought that the lapis that you find on the ground was pieces of this large sky that had fallen to the ground. And that the sky itself was this large, immensely huge stone that had cracks in it, and that's where the light was coming through. So that's sort of how they envisioned it. And then eventually, it's very interesting, but eventually it was seen as a place where metals came from, probably from meteorites, things like that. And so, because there's some evidence that metallurgy began with metals that were found in meteorites. I mean, there's a whole sort of debate about that. But so Kshathra Vaira is a very interesting and complex Amesha Spenta. And then there's the Spenta Armiti, who is the guardian of the earth, and she represents the property of devotion or the practice of devotion. She's female, obviously. And then Harvatat is the guardian of the waters. She's female and represents wholeheartedness. And then there's Amaritat, or the guardian of the plants, also female and represents the preservation of life. So the Amesha Spentas represent a balance between male and female, and animals and plants and fire. And then Ahura Mazda is the lord of all of them, the source from which all of them emerge. And Ahura Mazda is neutral, representing both male and female. And I included Anahita down here. As I mentioned, she is a Yazata. She is not considered one of the Amesha Spentas, but even today, in many rural areas, she is important and revered, and she represents fertility, love, and healing, and is probably a really, really, really old goddess figure. Zarathustra mentions her specifically, even though she is not one of the Amesha Spenta. So she was clearly a very important figure in his own mind, in his own devotional practice, and certainly remained that for Persian and Iranian peoples for a long time. Now, what's important about the Amesha Spenta is that you have to understand that they are abstractions and living beings. So they represent concepts like goodwill or devotion or wholeheartedness, but they are also living beings, and they also manifest physically as components of the natural world. So, for example, Asha Vahishta, the guardian of all fires, he represents truth and righteousness, but he is also an expression of Ahura Mazda in the world. And a lit fire that is ceremonially done correctly is like a window between Ahura Mazda and you. In other words, Asha Vahishta acts as sort of like an interface, if you will, between the spiritual world and the physical world. So they represent and express and manifest ethical ideas, as well as being physical manifestations of whatever they're the guardian of. So Amesha Almighty, who represents devotion and expresses devotion and is a guardian of the earth, is also expressed by the actual physicality of the earth. So that is her. That's her physical expression. In Zoroastrianism, there is no ultimate separation between the physical and non-physical worlds. That's why the physical world is affected by what's going on in the non-physical world, which is what we'll get to in a minute, because that's important. And this is significant because it completely violates all of our common conceptions of polytheism, monotheism, henotheism, all those theisms, which are, Western categories of trying to understand deity. Ahura Mazda and the Amesha Spenta occupy a place that really is not adequately expressed and defined by Western standards. But if you know anything about indigenous beliefs and practices, say in the Americas, or other indigenous people, none of these ideas are that weird. Okay, so Zoroastrianism retains that kind of indigenous perspective about the world, that the physical and non-physical realms are not separate. Even though we kind of experience them as separate, they're not really. Now, what's interesting is that traditionally there are no depictions of any of these beings. That's why I'm not showing you pictures of them, because traditionally there aren't pictures of them. Whether this has always been the case is not known, because one of the things we do know is that during the Sasanian reform, one of the things that the priesthood really wanted to do was eliminate all depictions of deity, period. And so it could be that there was a very real effort made to destroy whatever images might have existed or depictions that might have existed of the Amesha Spenta. So we don't really have any pictures of them as a result. And so we don't have pictures of them. And there you go. From a cosmological perspective, you do have what is called ontological and ethical dualism. Now, ontological means the nature of reality. In classic Zoroastrianism, it was held that, generally as it's understood, it was held that at the beginning of all things, there were two principles, and one was Ahura Mazda, who is the author of goodness and light, etc. But there existed this evil spirit, the Lord of the Lie, Angra Mainyu, or the destructive spirit, and his helpers that are often called the Drudge, which means the liars, essentially. And Angra Mainyu tries to corrupt and undo everything that Ahura Mazda does. And thus difficulty and evil is born in the world. And what's important for Zoroastrians is that this conflict between good and evil occurs in the spiritual world. That's where it begins. And because it begins in the spiritual world, it bleeds over into the physical world. So it's in the physical world because it started in the spiritual world first. Human beings were created to help Ahura Mazda defeat Angra Mainyu. So basically, evil and everything existed prior to humans being here. So humans didn't cause that to happen, all right? And so our purpose is to help eliminate evil in the world and help in the final, what's called refreshment of the cosmos, the rebirth of the cosmos, what's called the frashokareti. It's a wonderful word. It mean the image is that of, like a beautiful water sweeping over a desert, essentially. So refreshing the world and rebirthing it. However, we are not forced to do this. It's understood that we are born with absolute free will, and we are free to choose whether we live for good or live for evil. And so the cosmos will go depending on how we choose. Now, humans have helpers like Anahita, and these are the Yazatas, which I'll talk more about in just a second. And these are holy beings in all of nature who assist humans in doing good. So Yazatas are really, really important in helping human beings choose goodness. Humans have a soul, an Urvan, and a guardian spirit, Fravashi, that helps them along. And in fact, there's some evidence that the idea of the guardian spirit or guardian soul, such as that's understood in the West, may well have come from Zoroastrianism. When you die, your Urvan is judged in the presence of your Fravashi, and you'll end up either going to hell, which is not understood to be permanent generally, or heaven to join Ahura Mazda. There's some indication that some selected souls may return to reincarnate, but that's rare. Periodically, a Seoshyant, one who brings benefit, that's what that term means, who is born of a virgin, will be sent from Ahura Mazda to guide the people and to assist in the view in renewing the pledge of righteousness. Now, there are 3 or 6 of these. Prophecies vary, or the interpretation of these prophecies vary. Now, at the end of time, there's going to be a big battle between good and evil, and hopefully the good guys will win. But it's not understood to be a foregone conclusion. So the question is always, which side are you on? Are you on the side of good, or are you on the side of destruction and the lie? And in Zoroastrianism, the most important thing is choice, your decision. What is your decision to be? Are you on the side of the light, or are you on the side of destruction? So the power is with you, essentially, and your free will.